Hi guys, it's Mrs. Hale coming at you with a little bit of new technology and some review for you. So I wanted to start off with talking about period 1 for our AP exam review, and this is for the years 1491 to 1607. Now, as a heads up, this whole review is focusing on mainly like the Native Americans and that very first early European contact that we get through Christopher Columbus. So I have divided up my content into kind of 3 big categories. The first one is called contact. The second one is going to be commerce. And then the third bullet point or third web idea is going to be competing philosophies. Now, what I will also end up doing is talking to you and hopefully writing down at the end some supplemental info, key people, battles, terms, that type of idea that don't quite maybe fit on my web, but that you should jog your memory with for this era as well. So starting off, let's take a look at contact. So for contact, just keep in mind this is prior to Europeans arriving. And also keep in mind that the Native Americans, we could think of them in a couple different ways. One, we think of them as being very nomadic, but that's not the case for all of them. If you were nomadic, it meant that you moved around constantly, that in particular you were probably following the herd as your main food source. We see that in particular in North America, here in the United States and the Great Plains. But with the early Native Americans, what I want you to think about is the social, the economic, and the political structures of these societies, and how actually it was based on interactions with each other and the environment. Now, in this case, keep in mind some of these societies were actually pretty well advanced. And so some of the early contact that the Europeans had were going to be with like the Incan, the Mayan, and the Aztec. Now, as you can tell, like my Mayan, the N looks kind of funky, but sorry, like I don't know how to fix it right now. New technology. So with the Incan, the Mayan, the Aztec, what you need to understand is that they were vast and they had complex economies and roads. And this is like between the Incan, the Mayan, the Aztec in Mexico, Central America, and in South America. This is where we also get advancements in math, science, and calendars as well. Now, some other groups, kind of like the Incan, the Mayan, the Aztec, that you should just be aware of with the contact are going to be the Algonquin. And with the Algonquin, this is going to be your Secotan village. And this was an image in 1585 or so that we ended up looking at in class together. And we saw like the Native Americans kind of in circles, maybe a prayer circle, and then we saw some with like the different stages of crop growth. And so feel free to take a look back at that image to kind of jog your memory what I'm talking about if you're not quite sure. The other group for this early contact that I'm talking about is going to be like the Pueblo. And for the Pueblo, I'll talk more about them in my supplemental info, but keep in mind they were in the Southwest, so like modern day Arizona, New Mexico, and they also had vast irrigation systems for farming, which was remarkable for the time period, at least according to us. And then also they built multi-storied buildings that they ended up living in and as part of their society. So then let's talk about commerce. And with commerce, everything is going to revolve around overseas expansion by Europeans. And with that overseas expansion, you're basically going to be looking at the Columbian Exchange. Now, keep in mind, you can look at the Columbian Exchange, both the good and the bad. We tend to focus more on the good, but don't forget the bad of, obviously, the destruction of natives, especially due to biological diseases. With the Columbian Exchange, make sure that you note that this is going to result in the first permanent interaction. B/T will be between two worlds. Old world meaning Europe, new world meaning the Americas. Now, obviously, the Columbian Exchange is named after Christopher Columbus, so you cannot ignore him. But keep in mind with Christopher Columbus that you should note the good and the bad. The good is the Columbian Exchange, that first permanent interaction, right, and exchange between the two worlds. The bad, obviously, the destruction of Native Americans and the future changes to North America. But then also keep in mind his crew experiences. He was not always well liked by his crew members, especially for some of the treatment of them. So under commerce with the Columbian Exchange, and looking at the first permanent interaction between two worlds, what you need to look at is a couple different things. You need to look at the biological marketplace, if you will. Sorry about squeezing that in. You need to look at the flora and fauna. You could say, talking about horses, and I'll go into and elaborate more. Three sister farming, and then of course cash crops. So to elaborate on these last few bullet points here. So the biological marketplace is talking about the different diseases that ended up being interacted between Old World and New World. Things that decimated the Native Americans were like smallpox. Things that the Native Americans gave to the Old World to Europeans would be things like syphilis. As far as flora and fauna, so you're talking about, I guess you could also look at it as a way for talking about your food supply, but also other things like what we would now consider weeds, like dandelions. But keep in mind, European diets, and Europeans were not living very long due to their diet. And they needed, it was almost like a godsend that they came across the Americas and there was different food supply that could actually help them out. The idea of corn or potatoes or other food supplies that was growing in North America that was not in Europe at the time and could therefore be transported back and forth. It actually helped improve European livelihood. The horses, keep in mind, when the Spanish brought over the horses, particularly the Great Plains Indians, used it to their advantage for their nomadic lifestyle and even eventually for hunting like the different animals, the buffalo, the bison, but then even in wartime situations as well. Three sister farming, hopefully you remember, is corn, beans, and squash, or corn meaning maize, beans, and squash, but just the idea of crop rotation to let your soil rest, essentially, in between ideas. These are coming from the Native Americans. And then ultimately we have the development of the cash crops, which is going to be your idea of tobacco, vanilla, chocolate, and eventually cotton. So hopefully that gives you a good rundown if you remember the Columbian Exchange. But let's talk some more about commerce here for a moment. So with commerce, you are looking at riches and gold versus like the different barriers that were put in place and different ways that groups had to attain these riches and the gold, and interacting with the Indians and the problems that they came across. But even like the idea of you can't just step foot into a new land and start digging for gold. You have to set up an establishment. You have to be able to provide for your men like food, shelter, that type of protection. So the riches and gold versus the barriers, all these European nations want to always expand and get more. And then of course, you ought to remember about Spain, with the 3 G's, God, glory, and gold. Why did Spain go out? God, glory, gold. So then lastly here, we have the competing philosophies. And for the competing philosophies, you have 2 big kind of basic ideas. It's nothing super fancy, but you have the idea of slavery. And keep in mind, according to the Spanish, with slavery, you have the encomienda system. And the encomienda system, as we called it, was slavery in all but name. But keep in mind, the way that the Spanish developed the encomienda system is because the Spanish rulers told the Spaniards that were in the Southwest, in New Mexico and Arizona, go ahead, like, we will give you land and the natives that live on that land to help you work it. Now, some people were better off than others as far as the treatment of their Native Americans. And in my next part of the supplemental info, I will talk to you guys about like some of the problems like the Pope's rebellion and things like that, and Sepulveda de las Casas, and the differing opinions between the encomienda system. But then remember, eventually the encomienda system leads way to our, ooh, look at that fun pen there. 1 second, let me erase that. Green. But it leads us back to eventually the African slavery. And with the African slavery system, because we couldn't necessarily effectively enslave the Native Americans, we had to turn to another labor source. So then the other competing philosophy is going to be about spreading our influence and kind of like the reasons why. So think of it as material wealth, going back to that idea of commerce, and then looking at religion. Now, for religion at this time in Europe, there's big conflict between Protestants and Catholics. And that goes into Germany, Italy, France, Spain. Well, Spain is always really Catholic, but even England eventually, once she begins to explore and stuff like that. But so just looking at the different spread of influence and the reasons why we are going to the New World. So what I'm going to do now is try to get up a new screen and get you guys. So now I want to talk to you guys about supplemental info. And keep in mind, the supplemental info when I do these review videos is going to be the big concepts that maybe didn't fit into some of those other ideas that I talked about on the web, or additional people, terms, events, that type of thing. So one of the first things that you guys should remember about this time period is going to be the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait. So it's really over 30 to 40,000 years ago that the first, what we would now consider like Western Hemisphere Native Americans come over. And a key part of them is that they adapted to their environment. And it just shows kind of their resiliency and how they then ended up growing into semi-permanent establishments and settlements like your Pueblo, like your Algonquin, and even like your Iroquois. So when we talk about the Iroquois, we tend to think more about them closer towards the Revolutionary War, when they are part of like the Iroquois League and the Iroquois Confederacy and stuff like that. But keep in mind the Iroquois Confederacy formed earlier, and it shows the political power of some of the Native American tribes in order to join together for a common purpose. So you have different tribes adapting to their environment. You have semi-permanent establishments with like the traditional men and women and those gender roles associated with them. But then keep in mind you also have like the Great Plains Indians who are following the nomadic herds. Also keep in mind with the Vikings. Now the Vikings did end up coming over to North America, basically like to Newfoundland area, and we know that we don't have any real written documentation because that wasn't their thing, but we have through their sagas, through their stories, that they came to North America, and they never really were here for permanent establishments, but more to explore and to see what riches were out there. So in particular, I want to then go back to the Spanish in the Southwest. So I had mentioned on the previous slide when talking about competing philosophies that the Spanish had created the encomienda system, but I want to go more into that, okay? So you have, because of the encomienda system, you have two separate ideas, one by Sepulveda and one by a gentleman also named de las Casas. Now, they are both regarding encomienda, okay? And the idea behind this is that Sepulveda is going to defend the treatment, okay, of the natives, namely the Pueblo, but in the Spanish Southwest. And he's going to defend the treatment of them, defend the colonization of them, that type of idea. Whereas de las Casas is going to say that it is immoral and cruel. We had done our very first short answer question over this, and there was two different quotes, and you had to kind of juxtapose them. And at the time, it was tough, but now hopefully you have a little bit more knowledge and able to remember that, oh yeah, this is why Sepulveda believed this, or de las Casas, that type of thing. In addition to the Spanish in the Southwest with the encomienda system, you also have the idea of mestizos, and this is going to be the intermarriage between natives, B/T again, the Native Americans, and the Spanish. Now, and this is like the resulting, babies, if you will. But the Spanish relatively were okay with intermarrying to the Native Americans. Later on, I'll talk about how the French intermarried with the Native Americans in particular to help their trade and trapping industry, whereas then you compare it to the English, who absolutely did not intermarry with the natives and destroyed them. The last part about my supplemental info that I wanted to go into for you guys is going to be Pope's rebellion. So there should be an accent there over the E. So Pope's rebellion is in 1680, and it's modern day New Mexico. And what ends up happening is the Pueblo revolt against the Spanish. And in this particular rebellion, the Pueblo ended up killing about 400 Spanish, drove out 2,000 settlers from their area, and so it would be considered a win for the Pueblo. But you have 12 years later, or so, and this time it's going to be, again, the Pueblo versus the Spanish, but it's going to be Spain that just utterly destroys the Pueblo Indians in the Spanish Southwest. So this ends my review for period 1 and the supplemental info as well. Let me know any of your feedback or questions that you have. I hope you guys are doing well. Take care.